Hello, and welcome to Palisade Corporation's webcast, Using Simulation Techniques in Litigation, presented by Mike Pellegrino of Pellegrino & Associates. My name is Jamison Romeo Hall, and I will be your host today, and I'll be available to help answer WebEx technical questions by chat. If you experience technical difficulties joining this WebEx session, please dial 1-866-229-3239. At this time, all attendees are in a listen-only mode. Please note that as an attendee, you are part of a larger audience today. The attendee list is suppressed to maintain attendee privacy. We will be holding a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's presentation. You may ask an online question anytime throughout the presentation today by clicking on the question mark icon located on the floating toolbar. I would also encourage you to visit our website and sign up for a free trial download of our software. We invite you to sit back and relax and enjoy today's presentation. Mike, in a second, you have control.
Thank you. I am going to share my display now. And let me know if you can see this okay.
Looks good.
Well, good morning to everybody, or afternoon, depending on from where you're dialing in. It's my honor to speak with you today. I am Mike Pellegrino, President of Pellegrino & Associates. And we're going to talk about using simulation techniques in litigation, in particular in a case that we served as an expert witness for in North Carolina earlier this year. What we'll talk about today, just a brief intro as to who we are. We'll talk a little bit about the case, the assets that we were valuing, the challenges that we had as we were going through the project, the attack points that surfaced in the litigation, how we responded to those attack points, the court's response, and then follow up with a conclusion here. Basically about the firm, we were formed originally to value software embedded in equipment for tax purposes. I myself, former software guy turned finance and an accountant as well. Today we're a boutique IP valuation firm. We've got excellent credentials and references. We do work all over the country and internationally. It's been a fun run the last couple of years in particular, 40% compound growth a year. We do a lot of these kinds of presentations as well as more traditional conferences. I was at the Nano Business Alliance in Chicago last week. I was chair of a conference on IP valuation at Morningstar's headquarters a couple weeks back. We do a lot of writing as well, CFO Magazine, Journal of Taxation. I did a book on IP valuation in '09. We've got an update coming out next year. And writing one on software valuation and another one on early stage technology valuation that's on deck. What we do, valuation, so folks need to know how much technology is worth. It could be a patent, a copyright, a trademark, a trade secret. We'll get hired for those kinds of assignments. We look at a cross-section of a lot of different things, geographies, target markets, whether it's commercial, government, and so forth. We do a lot of market studies as well, subsets of valuation basically. Which markets to target, who the main players are, what are the pain points, how much do you charge vis-a-vis competing technologies. Are there applicable technology transfers? Let's say you've got a platform semiconductor technology and you're focusing it in a certain area, and well, maybe it's in the RF communications. Maybe we see some applications doing other things that aren't communications based, and what might that look like? And then interestingly, how might the technology reasonably be adopted by the market? This case in particular was a statutory buyout case in North Carolina. The cause was Vernon versus Cuomo, and there's a lot of other parties involved in that, but that's the main title for the case. And you can find this online at the North Carolina Complex Business Court. In its most basic sense, it's a nasty divorce of business partners. The company and its principals had some disagreements about how to move forward in the company. The company itself was a firm called Tribal Film Research, Inc. And basically, there were a couple of principals in the organization who were no longer directly associated with it, and the defendants were the company and some of the primary folks who were still with the company. Basically, a group of very intelligent scientists and other folks who just had different ways that they were looking to take the different ideas on how to take the company to the market. So they basically had a nasty divorce. So 2 of the 5 principals were plaintiffs, and the balance were the defendants. And the court had rendered a verdict in favor of the plaintiffs. And basically what had to happen was the defendants had to buy out the plaintiffs' interests in the company. So plaintiffs had about 40% of the company, so if it was worth $1 million, the defendants would have to write a check for $400,000. If it was worth $10 million, they'd have to write a check for $4 million. So naturally, it's important to establish the basis for the company so that the defendants can buy out that interest. As a background, we're not going to disclose anything that was filed under seal. There's certain things that are proprietary that we're not going to mention in the webinar today, but a lot of things that we're going to talk about are a matter of public record. And some of the other things that we're going to talk about have no direct bearing on the case, but speak to the general trend and strategies that one might use to defend the simulation use from attack. So the case looks at several different technologies. One is a technology that the tribal film called Triboglide. It's a syringe lubricant that is better than a traditional free silicon oil-based lubricant. The second was a coating. It's called Stay Clear, which is a scratch-resistant coating for polycarbonate and other clear materials. Interestingly, and this is somewhat of a departure from a lot of litigation where an expert is hired by one party to either present or refute the value evidence of another party. We were actually hired as a neutral expert to opine on the firm value based on both of these technologies. And so our ultimate client was the court. Now, both parties paid our fees, but it wasn't a traditional adversarial relationship. Our valuation outcome would be the same no matter what. We don't get into situations where folks are looking for an expert to confirm a predetermined conclusion. We tend to let the facts drive the value conclusion and not the other way around, letting the value conclusion drive which facts you want to include to present a certain story. So ultimately, the court would be relying on our valuation to set the terms between the plaintiffs and the defendants for a buyout. The assets, Triboglide is basically a cross-linked immobilized perfluor polyether lubricant used primarily in medical syringes. And basically what they would do is you take a syringe that you might deliver a drug in, and they have a rubber stopper, an elastomer stopper, and then you have the syringe barrel, which can be glass or it can be plastic. And you need a lubricant in order to make that syringe function properly. And right now they use a lot of free silicon oil based lubricants, and what happens there is the silicon oil tends to permeate the entire surface. It migrates very easily. So think about this: if you put a drop of silicon oil on a desk, it's going to eventually cover the entire desk because it migrates that well. So it serves as a very effective lubricant between the syringe wall and the elastomer stopper, the plunger basically. But the problem is that the free silicon oil can foul certain drugs, particularly large molecule drugs. So you think about insulin, and if you are a diabetic and you have to take insulin injections, you have to look at your insulin, and if it becomes cloudy while you're mixing it and getting ready to dose it, that means that you're starting to see contamination, and you basically have to throw out the drug and then start over. So there's a need to be able to retain the low friction ability or the desirability of that lubricant, but at the same time you want to try and immobilize it so that it's not going to interact or foul the drug that is inside of the syringe. And so they figured out a neat way to do that with a perfluor polyether lubricant, which will tend to be more compatible with some of the drugs that are out there that might come and interact with the lubricant. And they had 7 patents and patent applications that dealt with the application of that technology. And it included not only the use of perfluoropolyether in this particular field of use, but also how to go about manufacturing and basically immobilizing that lubricant on the syringe walls. The other product of interest is one called Stay Clear. Same kind of lubricant, it's perfluoropolyether-based scratch-resistant coating for clear plastics such as polycarbonate. Polycarbonate's neat in the sense of it looks like glass, except it's not. But the challenge is it scratches very easily. So hard coats become important as a means to mitigating the scratch tendencies of those plastics without creating a situation where you're actually reducing the visibility through the surfaces or creating haze on the surfaces and things along that line. The company at the time had de minimis revenues from both products. It's an early stage company, it's a startup. And that's why they came to us. We were actually referred in by another very well qualified expert who does not do valuation of early stage technologies, but it tends to be the area where we tend to focus. So for practical purposes, this becomes an intellectual property valuation, a standalone IP valuation for each product. The reason being that the company and the IP are inextricably tied. So if the company doesn't have the IP, it doesn't really have any value at all, aside from whatever it would cost to set up a new entity through state filings and so forth. So the de minimis revenue, some of that was due to litigation. If you're an early stage company and you're trying to sell a large pharmaceutical company, for example, on the merits of your technology, it could put people off to actually adopting the technology until the litigation is settled. And then some of that was also just the stage of the development stage for the technologies. So that creates some interesting challenges. Both technologies are early stage, which means that it's unproven in the market yet. So that creates difficulties in attempting to forecast the market response to the technology. So we see market forecasts all the time. There's one that I was referring to a couple of months back on the project we did on electric vehicles, which was interesting because it said, and this study was originally written in 2001, and it said by 2009 there'd be several million electric vehicles for sale in the U.S. and they would be all over the vehicle registration databases. And of course that's directly testable now. We can go back to 2009 and look at it and see how many electric vehicles that were sold in the market. And Tesla being the only pure play electric vehicle manufacturer in the U.S., it was pretty easy to see what they had done. In their entire history, they'd sold about 1,100 cars. So certainly a far cry from where we were in 2001, where the market thought it might be going. So those same kinds of challenges were directly apparent in this project as well, only worse in the sense of here you have to create a value that's going to be defensible. You don't want to unjustly enrich the plaintiffs by saying that it's too high if in fact the probability of that value being high is difficult to measure. But at the same time, you don't want it to be too low because that would unfairly enrich the defendants, meaning that their buyout of the plaintiffs would be at a lower cost than what would be equitable to both parties. So as you can imagine, the market adoption rate, pricing points, and so forth, how long it's going to take became very contentious issues in the case. Both technologies tested well in the lab. There's some question in certain cases of commercial appeal and fit. And what we found as we did our due diligence is that for a variety of reasons, value proposition, performance, and others, Triboglide had the greater market appeal. Stay Clear had promised but required greater research for a variety of reasons, the least of which being UV degradation on the product. You think about these coatings, they're depending on the chemical composition of them, they might have to deal with degradation from UV, so you might have to put UV inhibitors into the product, but in the process of doing that, you ultimately might change the performance characteristics of the product. So it's a very fine line of trying to create a product that is going to wear well in conventional environments, which are pretty hostile, yet also retain the superior performance that they can see from the lab testing. Both parties, of course, have their own objective for the valuation. The plaintiffs want it as high as possible because if they're being bought out, that means they get a bigger piece. The defendants want it as low as possible because that means they have to write a smaller check. In the middle of all this, of course, is the fact that it's a development stage company, and anybody who's worked with development stage companies will know that these are dear dollars that they're spending not only on litigation, but on R&D efforts and expert witness fees and things like that. So we had a very interesting time trying to sort through a lot of that. We wound up being the neutral experts. Our client, again, was the court. We didn't really care what the value conclusion was. We never do. What we care about is that we go through a credible process to get to the heart of the matter. What are the facts? And from those facts, what conclusions can we draw that are going to be defensible and reasonable? So the project process was fairly involved on due diligence. We had on-site meetings with both parties, a lot of off-site research as well. We looked at literally hundreds of different sources, a lot of it in the academic research, a lot of it in patents, and a lot of it in market analyses for the need in the respective markets. We had to spend a lot of time understanding the rights attributable to the intellectual property protections. This becomes real important if you think you have coverage on a patent, for example, and it turns out that your claim structure doesn't afford you that coverage. Well, the value that you might think you have in a particular market application or field of use might not be there. So it's very important to understand what rights specifically we're looking at. The next is how long does it take to finalize the technology and get it into the market? This becomes a time value of money issue, and that becomes really important when you're looking at early stage technologies that use high discount rates for discounted cash flow models. A lot of the discount rates that we use on technologies can be anywhere from 45 to 80 or 90%, which means that if I'm a bank and you're giving me $100, and I have a 90% discount rate, that means I have to give you $90 in interest on an annual basis, and that compounds. So when you think about a technology that might be deferred 5 years into the future before you get those first dollars, the value of those dollars becomes quite a bit less over time. So the velocity with which one can get into the market, it becomes very important. And these are all things that we actually model discreetly in the models. Not only when they enter the market, but how long the R&D process might take, how long the FDA process might take, and also what sort of velocity would this technology ultimately adopt at. If you think about cell phones, at the macro view, cell phones took 30 years before you had significant population penetration. But now new cell phone models, they enter the market and they reach their mature market share in 3 to 6 months. So a definite difference in velocity, even though the core technology might be very similar. We also had to spend a lot of time understanding the market. Who are the buyers and licensees for these potential technologies? Because they're ultimately the ones that are going to drive the conversion of the utility from the patents that Tribal Film owned into dollars. And this is an interesting dynamic, especially when you think about large pharmaceutical companies. They're the ones who have the most to gain from changes in the delivery mechanisms, but they're not the ones who actually produce the syringes. So you're looking to other companies like Vedder or Schott or Becton Dickinson, and they have their own ideas as to what kind of product they want to sell. So it becomes an interesting, complicating factor in terms of figuring out how to get that product through the supply chain. And then, of course, there are differences on the same fact patterns, like art. Looking at a picture, a painting on the wall, you can have two people that draw something completely different out of the same physical representation of an object. And we see that with valuation, too. You have the same set of facts, and people have their own background and their own experiences that they're using to evaluate those facts. And naturally, when they do, that's going to change their perception as to the importance and the total contribution of those facts. And so that has an impact on the valuation. As we're doing the due diligence, we ask, what is the sky? What color is it? And is it blue or is it black? And you get back instead a PhD dissertation as to the weather patterns and whether solar flares are coming into play, and it becomes very difficult to sort through some of that. So as we look at these technologies and the value proposition, that's to serve a relevant purpose. And all of this sets the context for how we did some of the modeling that we ultimately had to defend. Ultimately, we want to increase free cash flows. And in the target markets that we're looking at, it might be better efficacy, so lower acute or chronic cost if you're thinking drug, or better quality of life, or can you charge more for that competing product or get greater market share? There might also be cost savings. Can you manufacture a product for less than a competitor? So let's say you have a new process for producing insulin, and it leads to a cost reduction. That can create value because it might be an internal, now you're just selling bioequivalent insulin and just getting greater margin, or you could actually reduce the price, get greater market share, and increase your total value as well. So I spent a lot of time looking at the value propositions of those technologies. And in both cases, they relate to performance. So for the syringe lubricant, it was lower frictional forces to operate the syringe. It won't foul the drug with persistent drug contact. And ultimately, that really drives a narrow market focus in the pre-filled syringe segment. On the clear coating, it was better as an anti-scratch coating. It had superior test results for scratch resistance. And like I said, naturally, both parties had different views on the value proposition. And in the end, what we found most of the value was in the syringe lubricant, had a better value proposition in the market, and also greater market interest. So let's get to the crux of the issue and the focus of the webinar here, is how do we account for that uncertainty? Valuation analysts lack perfect information. So this gets right to the reliability and credibility of the valuation models. A lot of the common unknowns we look at: pricing, margins, units sold, execution risk, which might be represented several different ways. The ability to get a product through regulatory hurdles, or the ability for a company historically to take a product from conception to delivery in the market successfully. Technological obsolescence, market velocity, development timeline. There are many others as well. What we find is that a lot of valuation analysts ignore the impact of the uncertainty, and they basically reduce it down to crude approximations with best case, worst case, and expected case modeling, which is a form of discrete analysis. You're looking at each one and you're keeping all other variables the same and saying, all right, if I change this one, what's the sensitivity analysis on it? And we find that it's crude and it does not match reality very well. And it's not going to give a lot of clarity to the court as to the relative importance of the factors, and if we're off on something, how important is that overall? And that might lead the court to render a decision that might not be equitable to both parties. Many valuation analysts also ignore the interdependencies of the exogenous variables. So if you say, well, we're going to change the pricing and we're going to allow the sensitivity in pricing to vary, well, we know from classic economic theory that the utility of a technology and its relation to price can drive the demand, and they're using difference curves for that typically. So what happens if you lower the one value and then let's say you lower price, you might see an uptick in demand. Well, if you're lowering price and not changing demand, which is what a all else the same model would suggest, you're not really reflecting the behavior of the market appropriately. But that's the easier thing to fix, because maybe you change both variables at the same time. But then you get into a scalability problem, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment. For a situation where you have a lot of variables and they have a lot of potential states, so what I call the nx to the y power. So think about n, that might be the number of variables that you have, x is the number of states that they can be, and y is the number of them. So basically you can't rely on this all else the same kind of mentality for doing sensitivity analysis, because it just doesn't work. It doesn't have a theoretical grounding that matches reality, so that leads that discredits the analysis right from the start. Frankly, if I were that good as a valuation analyst, I've been doing this for quite a while now, I would basically be day trading stocks on a beach someplace, because I'd have perfect information. I wouldn't need to do this because I would already know what the outcome of the stock market would be at any given point, and just take the trades appropriately. So let's look at some of the basics, and I'm not going to get into a lot of complex math here, but it'll just kind of show you some of the challenges that you have to deal with. So you flip one fair coin. It's fairly easy. The discrete math dictates you have two outcomes, 50% probability of head or tails, and if you flip that coin 1,000 times or 10,000 times, on average you're going to see about half of them are going to be heads, half of them are going to be tails. So what happens when you start flipping two coins? Well, now you're introducing complexity. So you can have two heads, or a head and a tails, or tails and a head, or two tails. So flipping two coins, you have 4 possible outcomes. 3 coins, 8. 4 coins, 16. So there's an exponential relationship there where the number of coins, as that increases, you're increasing geometrically the range of probability, or the permutations that you can be looking at. And if you're dealing only in two-dimensional data, it gets very easy to graph that until you get to 3 variables or more, and then you start getting into additional dimensions we have no visualization for. So let's think about it in terms of a die. Fairly simple. It can have 6 values on it. Roll 1 die, you have 1 of 6 outcomes you can get. If you roll 2 die, it's 1 of 36. You can get snake eyes, you can get 12s, you can get 7. It's, people think 7 is lucky. Well, it's not really. It's just the one mathematically that you'll get the most often when you roll die on a statistical basis. If you roll 3 die, you get 216 different outcomes. So obviously what we find is that the number of input values and the number of inputs increases the number of possible outcomes very quickly. And it gets beyond the realm of calculating them manually very quickly as well. Yet the reality of the situation is that this is what we have to do all the time when we're doing valuation, and that this is not something that we can manually do. So this is where the simulation techniques become real important. So the real world. We're back out of the petri dish and back into what we have to deal with on a daily basis. We have to take literally an infinite number of inputs and reduce those down into something that we can model, and then also account for the uncertainty on those. So in our valuation models, we reduced it down to 27 different discrete inputs that we modeled. The scratch-resistant coating had 8 more. So we had a total of 35 discrete inputs that we were looking at. And that's unmanageable to do manually. You can't do best case, expected case, and worst case on those. On any one of them, number one, because it's just a lot of labor, and there's a lot of potential variables that you can have. But the other thing is that the number of permutations gets really large really quickly. So if we had only 10 possible values for a given input, let's say it's price, it could be $1, it could be $1.25, $1.35, and so forth. If you had only 10 of those for 35 inputs, you're looking at a pretty big number. I don't even know what they call that number, but it's got a lot of commas on it. So I think it's beyond a Google or a Google kind of number. So our problem, unfortunately, was more difficult than that. We didn't have discrete data like a die that had only 6 outcomes. We had a pricing for a potential royalty rate or a pricing for a drug savings in the market by not having to foul and throw away a lot of drug that's contaminated from free silicon oil. Those have literally infinite number of possibilities within reason. So the possibility for each exogenous input, for practical purposes, had hundreds of values, but the permutations were just unfathomable. So how do we address the uncertainty? Of course, we use the simulation techniques, and we use a lot of the tools from the decision tool suite to do that. It's typically a Monte Carlo and hypercube sampling. We assign ranges for the key inputs. We're driving those, importantly, from real-world data to the extent we can. So we're doing samplings on pricing data, or we're looking at margins on average, or we're looking at the number of drugs that might actually have some benefit from this technology that might sell in a pre-filled form. We're looking at the average time it might take to get one of those drugs through a new packaging through the FDA. And we're trying to get a good understanding for what the mean and the value might look like, and then what the edges look like. As you can imagine, if you look at the average salary and you find out that it's $50,000 and that 90% confidence interval you're between $45,000 and $55,000, that's going to show a fairly tight dispersion about the mean. But if your average salary is $50,000, but at the 90% confidence interval, it could be as low as 15 or as high as 92. Now you're seeing that you don't have as much compactness in the data, and that speaks to the reliability of the input. So basically, at risk, we'll run the iterations. We'll pick values within the ranges of those key inputs, and then store the resulting valuation calculations that we can then look at later. The results of the valuation distributions, and this is an interesting thing. If you read Trigogoras' book on real options, he is not a big fan of simulation techniques because he would assert that it doesn't give you an actionable plan. But really what we find is that the results are directly auditable because we have what the results are. So if we're saying, all right, well, what's the average condition look like for a valuation that might be worth $10 million, we can actually look at the the key inputs and see what conditions would tend to drive that. So it's auditable. It gives us remarkable insights with the variance associated with each value through the regression analysis, and which value drivers are most significant and by how much. And this becomes important when we started having to defend ourselves against attack. It gives you a statistical view of the valuation model, the means, the medians, modes, tails, and so forth. So as you look at this chart, you think about the greater the variance, which might be that red distribution. These all have the same means, but the red distribution's got the greatest amount of variance associated with it, so it's the least reliable indicator here of value if we were looking at these three lines as separate indications of value. The darker blue is better, and then the lighter blue is the best. And the reason is because you're seeing a greater concentration about the mean of the combination of all those different inputs over time. So some of the inputs that you might look at, again, this isn't related to this project, but it's just an example of some of the things you might look at. So if you're thinking market share, it could be between 0 and 100%, or if you're selling stuff, let's say you're doing a computer software thing, which I think what this might have been. What's your pricing premium in the market over somebody else? And you base these inputs on real-world data to the extent you can, and so that gets to what sort of how broad a net are you casting when you're doing that sampling, and are you introducing survivorship or sampling biases into the process? And that's going to be an attack point for somebody on the other side. And you say, well, I don't believe the data that you used. I think your inputs were inappropriate. And that's what we saw as an attack point on the pricing side. The plaintiffs think we didn't have enough high-value inputs onto the pricing, whereas the defendants thought we gave too much weight to some high-value pricing. The output sample, let's say you're looking at something, again, fictitious example here, but you could see definitely a essential tendency on this technology of around 700 million or so, really long tail to the right. You see this a lot with technology that might be disruptive. You think about pharmaceuticals, a lot of high risk, low value, but a big tail to the right. Because if it becomes a blockbuster, it can be remarkable. As an interesting aside, the most valuable product ever created by man, in my estimation, was a patent that was filed in 1991. The product entered the market in 97. As of the end of 2009, it was generated $105 billion in revenue. If it were standalone, it'd be a Fortune 180 company. Its patent value is worth more than most of the S&P 500 companies on a standalone basis. And it was the Lipitor patent. And it's remarkable. 44 million patients a day that take it. And we haven't found anything in the market that had that kind of velocity and that kind of economic value creation. So you think about where it shows up here. Might have a mean that's fairly low, but if it goes, it's going to go in a big way. And it's pretty neat to look at those kind of things. Of course, regression analysis, this is where the money really becomes, this is where the money investment in the software really starts to pay off. Because a courtroom is a theater, and there's a lot of actors out there, and they're opining for as to the importance of different variables, and especially if you're an expert witness, you have to defend yourself against what can be a lot of character assassination or other things that are part and parcel with sitting in the hot seat. And so this really, the regression analysis really helps focus the testimony on the things that are relevant. So the litigation attack points, as we looked at it here, it was beyond the basics of qualifications. Both parties, before we ever got started, qualified us as experts. We wouldn't have gotten the job otherwise to do it. And they were certainly comfortable that we had competence in the space. So then the question is, did we apply the techniques appropriately? First and foremost, is the valuation model correct? If it's wrong, then every derivative conclusion is wrong also. So you think about garbage in, garbage out. Well, this is even worse than that. If this is saying fundamentally, if we model something that doesn't even closely match the reality of how they might monetize the IP in the market, then the entire model is irrelevant regardless of the simulations that we run on it. Then are the inputs correct? If not, again, the entire model could be wrong. Then you get into some of the more subtle differences. Are the variances and distributions associated with each input appropriate? If not, that may elevate or demote the importance of variables in the regression analysis. And then lastly, are the outputs appropriate? Are we coming through and saying that this nascent technology is worth $4 billion in a market that only has an appetite for $1 billion in its entirety, and you're only getting a portion of that? Well, those kinds of things are nonsensical, so you've got to be able to test the reasonableness of those conclusions. So is the valuation model correct? There was no major attack point here. It was basically an integrated decision tree and discounted free cash flow model. Interestingly, both parties disavowed it after we developed it, even though both parties helped develop it, which I thought was interesting. The second one is, are the inputs correct? And in this we had a question from counsel on both parties. And that was really, that gets back to the quality of the research that we had done beforehand. For example, we showed that on the pre-filled syringes that there might be a number of companies that would be interested in this, more than one or two that they were initially interested in. And we got challenged pretty hard on that, like, well, how did you come to that conclusion? And it was fairly straightforward for us to answer that because we had good background data. We looked at it and said, well, at the time there were 5,696 drugs, parenteral drugs, which are injectable drugs approved by the FDA, of which about 80% of those were concentrated in a number of companies. There were about 400 companies that you could look at, but only about 50 of them were really doing anything meaningful in the market. And we just started working the math down that way, and we were able to justify our conclusions on that very, very well. So then we started looking at market penetration rates, units sold, and price per units, and stuff like that. And that got interesting because you think about high volume syringe manufacturing. You've got a line that's running at 1,000 syringes a minute or more. Pennies become very important, and tenths of pennies become very important in terms of the overall production, because if you're making a billion syringes a year and you can shave 1/10 of a cent off of something, that's tens of millions of dollars you might be looking at. So if you're showing a packaging product that's going to show a premium pricing that is anywhere between pennies to dollars, you need to have a good fact pattern on that. And there's some interesting things that we found out there. Just repackaging a drug, for example, moving from a lyophilized format to a pre-filled, you might be able to get a premium in the market just because it's an easier use. And you also reduce the amount of extra drug that you waste that's not going to be used in going from a vial to the syringe. And so when you think about biologic drugs that are very expensive, if insulin costs $500 a gram to produce, and you can throw away less insulin, that means you don't have to produce as much, or you can actually lower the price because you don't have to do overfill as much. So there's all sorts of ways that you're creating value, and to the extent you can capture some of that value from the end user, which might be the patient, that's tough. But what about the pharmaceutical company that might be able to reduce the cost of goods sold on a biologic drug by $200 million a year? Are they willing to pay pennies or dollars for that kind of thing just by changing the packaging? So those are some of the things that you have to look at. Then you get into are the variances and distributions correct? And this is where we had to spend a lot of time defending the report. And then ultimately, are the outputs appropriate? And we had to spend a lot of time there as well. But before we even get into that, there's a bigger issue. Not many people use these kinds of tools in litigation that we've seen so far. The case law is pretty light on it. And the reason is it's difficult to explain. And the concept of Monte Carlo analysis, even if you do it manually, what they used to do in the 60s, where you have tables and you would just look up random number generators in tables, as opposed to having a computer generate a pseudo-random number. I mean, it gets to even that's hard to explain. But we look at it looking at it more from the law of large numbers and explaining it to the court. And once we got through that barrier, it became very understandable to the judge what exactly it is that we did. Because they're used to seeing your best case, expected case, worst case. That's very conceptually easy to understand. So the analogy that we used was that life insurance actuaries. If you look at a life insurance company, they can predict with remarkable precision how long a demographic is going to live. Because they have maybe they have 50,000 or 100,000 different people that they're sampling from a particular geography. So they can predict within hundreds of basis points what the overall life expectancy might be for that population. And then after they know that, they can price their policies appropriately. So they can do that with remarkable precision, but they can't pick me out of anybody in the crowd and say, all right, I'm going to live till I'm 74, because I could get hit by a truck tomorrow, or I can live till I'm 90. So the sample size there is too small. As soon as we explained it in those terms, that best case, expected case, worst case, it's really not bringing much clarity because your sample size is so small. When we broaden it, we have a greater population to draw from. That's when the aha light goes on. And so that really helped helped the court understand really what we were doing. The next thing you look at are the variances if distribution is correct. The defendants, more so than the plaintiffs, didn't like the variances on the inputs, especially deriving the per unit royalties. But again, we had a reasonable fact pattern to look at. We could look at the differences in drug pricing based on packaging decisions in the market. Because it's easy. You can go look at what it would cost to go buy it at a pharmaceutical sales organization. Or you could look at what the price for different packaging is in the market, just by looking at the differences in syringes. They had silicone-free syringes, and what's the price premium on that versus a free silicone oil syringe. So those kinds of data points allow us to better defend the variance conclusions that we use. Interestingly, and we didn't know it, they brought a ringer in the day before the trial, and it was a PhD statistician, and his objective was basically to obfuscate the proceedings and discredit the simulation analysis. And it was an expert witness brought in by the defendants more so than the plaintiffs. And so the statistician complained about some of the sampling algorithms we use or some of the distributions that we use. And really that gets to how, if you look at the sampling algorithms, it gets to really how closely are you approximating the distribution that you're trying to draw. So the Latin hypercube more closely approximates the shape you're looking to get. But we run these both ways, so it doesn't matter for our perspective. We see little variance overall in the number based on what kind of sampling algorithm we use. So I spent a lot of time, focusing on that thing. We said, look, this is a non-issue. It didn't even change the value a 0.1% when we ran it both ways. But the important thing is we ran it both ways, so we knew that going into it. Then the other one, and this is one we see a lot with economists that start trying to attack these models, complaining about our R-squareds being too high, whatever that means. Too high is a relative measure, of course, not an absolute one. Well, our response here is that it should be high. We don't have random variance in our models. We're introducing all the variance into our models explicitly with the distribution functions that we use. So it's not uncommon for us to have R-squareds well into the 90% or greater. The only time when we don't is when we wind up doing some stuff, some code behind the form, some VBA stuff that might change the inputs that are outside the control of that risk. That's just part of my own personal disease, being a software guy, a finance guy, and an accountant all in one body. So in those situations, we would tend to see a lower R-squared. But here, because we control all the input variance, we don't have that random error in our model. It's not like we're trying to correlate changes in mortgage interest rates to housing starts, and there's other factors that might be unexplainable there. That's how an economist looks at R-squared. That's not what we have to deal with here. We're controlling all the inputs, so a lot of time spent having to defend that. In the end, what we found, the defendants spent a lot of time, an inordinate amount of time, on statistical details that they really had no impact on the ending results. And ultimately, we found them to be ineffective. At one point, we wound up killing the questions because we just kind of stopped and said, and this is kind of a paraphrase of exactly how I said it, but it's like, you're arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Why don't you fix the hull? Because all of these things, even if we were off by an order of magnitude or two, we're not going to materially change the value conclusion. So the next is, are the outputs correct? So we benchmark our valuation outputs against other comparable transactions in the market. We don't see a lot of practical purpose in doing that because patents are unique and novel by definition. So it doesn't matter what other things sold for. Every patented technology is going to bring its own value proposition to the market. And if it didn't, it wouldn't have a patent. That's by definition, it goes against the intent of what a patent is. For example, there's no comparable for Lipitor in the market. So who are you going to find that would value a drug that's generated $12.8 billion in revenue? There is no other drug that generated $12.8 billion in revenue. So the idea of a comparable there is meaningless. Moreover, it gets into the situation of fair value versus fair market value versus investment value, and that gets to the value standard that you're using. A lot of the transactions that you might look at are not forced sales like this one is in a statutory buyout case. So you've basically got you're a seller with a gun to your head or a buyer with a gun to your head. That's not going through a traditional negotiation process among disinterested third parties. We wind up ultimately testing the conclusions for reasonableness, not only on the inputs, but also on the outputs. We found that there are about five variables had statistical significance, and we found that the defendants in particular spent a lot of time arguing on stuff that wasn't even in the top 15. And so, when you get below 5 or 6, you can imagine that the statistical significance of those really tended to fall through the floor. So stuff that was interesting, of course, the per syringe royalty rate, the discount rates that we used, and then who might the first companies be that license it. You wanted to be one of the larger companies that are dealing with pre-filled syringe product, and when that might occur. Everything else really had de minimis impact. And like I said, even if we were off by an order of magnitude on some of that, it really didn't matter. And so the takeaway here is that that regression analysis, I said it earlier, I mean, that's worth the price of admission for the software. Because, think about it, if you're not in a courtroom having to defend against an aggressive attorney, but you're in the boardroom having to defend a capital investment or why you did an acquisition, this kind of analysis is as powerful. And we've done a lot of IP transactions and capital fundings for clients. And, we wind up using that output quite a bit to articulate a particular position on the value. The other thing that becomes real important is understanding solidly the theory behind simulation and how to interpret the results. I've seen people try and explain this in different forms that I've done over the years, and not being able to articulate that or not being able to understand some of the limitations of it, of the use of the tool, can open you up to some credibility problems, and it might cause somebody to discredit the analysis altogether. But we were fortunate. Despite the extreme challenges, and the judge in the order, and you can find the order online, said this was not an easy assignment to do. The simulation techniques were certainly new, but they thought we did the analysis competently, and we defended it appropriately, not only the rationale but the inputs. And actually, the judge in the order said things I couldn't have paid a judge to say nicer things about us in the order. They tended to use the low end of our value for the basis. And from a practical perspective, as a valuation guy, that's about as good an outcome as an expert can ever want in a proceeding. So that really takes us to the end of the meat of the presentation. So the summary, it's important to model the value proposition appropriately, and I think we did that. We narrowed the market quite a bit into the pre-filled syringe market against the wishes of the plaintiffs who thought it had broader market appeal. You've got to have a reasonable basis for the inputs and the associated variances that you're using. You have to test the value conclusion against norms within the industry. You have to spend a lot of time doing research and defending those inputs that have the greatest statistical significance. So what we do is we ran through the model internally. We found out which ones had the greatest importance, and then we went back and we double-checked and triple-checked our sources to see if we did as wide a pass across the literature as we could. And the last thing you want to do is have some piece of information that shows up and impeaches you in the witness stand. And lastly, we had to understand the theory behind simulation, the limitations, and also how to interpret those results and present them in an understandable form to a lay audience. So with that, I am going to conclude the formal presentation part of the webinar here and open it up to questions.
That was great, Mike. Thank you so much. Yeah, let's wait a minute or two and see if we have anybody typing in some questions. In thinking about this, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised at how everybody wanted to look for different ways to attack your analysis, and it's so heartening to see it bounced right back to them. And I'm glad the judge went for. I'm glad we were able to help a little bit in your presentation in a way that helped everybody understand it. And I think people will really like this webcast. Have any anybody typing in anything.
Okay, well, if there are no questions, then I will tend to the balance of the time, Jameson, to you and the audience.
I guess we don't have any. Once this judgment goes out, I guess it becomes part of legal precedent, right? And have you heard anything more coming back about that?
Well, it's interesting. We had, after the decision came out, we had 2 different state bar associations invite us out to talk about the case and some of the details of it and some of the challenges. You know, a lot of the kinds of material that we cover today.
That's great. Well, I think this is going to be a great resource, and again, I'm going to send the link out to everybody here, and I guess everybody who missed it, you'll be hearing this. And if you have any questions, please email me or call me, and I can forward them to Mike, no trouble. And I want to thank everybody for coming. And Mike, thank you so much.
My pleasure. It's my honor to speak before everybody today.
It's been great. Okay, I guess that's it for today. Oh, wait. Oh, good. Could we just have one person who says, this is great to be able to model the law case outcome? Great. Okay. Hey, thanks, everybody. And we'll see you again.